Ali, Polly, Amy, Austin, and Brianna. Good stuff. Okay, so we might get started. What we're doing today is just looking through the PowerPoint I just sent around to everyone.
Oh, okay.
I'm trying to share that through my screen, but it's not working. Ah, now we can. So can everyone see that?
Mm.
Yep. Yes.
Yep.
Yep.
You can see the PowerPoint? Yeah?
Yep.
So one thing I'll just say to just be aware we are recording. So David will crop this later. He'll crop it later and we'll send it around to everyone as an audio session as well. But firstly, look to acknowledge Gina doesn't work. Putting this together with myself and Gina has worked with the NDIS. She's also a panel member on with restricted practices. I used to be a panel member back in the day in ADAC with Gina as well. So there's going to be a few changes in terms of the restricted practices coming out. However, I wanted to just give you a basic framework for what we're working with. So we might just run through it and I guess ask questions as we go. You've all got access to this, but if it's real, like if it's going to be a lengthy conversation, we'll park that and talk about it another time. And we might send out I'll send out a blank template just for everyone to add any questions you've got specifically around restricted practices. Now, this is a key part of your work, and I'm going to start with where it comes from. So, if we look at the second one, try not to go too far ahead, but we're looking at the RPAs are coming basically from the human rights, so the UN Convention for people with a disability. So we need to understand and educate people in the sector that this is the person's right to have a safeguard around them, which means that we're advocating for that. So when we identify unauthorized restricted practices, we need to then go through the framework of reporting that and talking to the provider around, well, one, have they reported it? And what have they done in terms of the NDIS reporting of unauthorized restricted practices? So we're looking at the UN Convention. These are the basics, and making sure that people have dignity, they're respected in the place that they're being supported. So I'm not going to go word for word, but you can see the screen and see where it's coming from. Now, we're following a number of other legislations. So part of that is the facts legislation or requirements around restricted practices, especially authorization and notification. And then also the federal government. So the facts is the state government and federal government is the NDIS. Now we're funded by the NDIS, so we predominantly need to follow all of the legislation, but predominantly the NDIS framework around the Quality Safeguard Commission. So we're in New South Wales, obviously, and if you're not aware, there are different, I guess, standards in terms of each state. At the moment, New South Wales and South Australia are the only ones fully doing the reporting guidelines. Other places like Perth and Queensland, they're not up to speed as yet in terms of the reporting framework. So in New South Wales, we need to make sure that we're reporting chemical, mechanical, environmental, and physical restraints, as well as seclusion. So that would be keeping someone in isolation. Now, we also need to make sure that the reporting process is in place as well. So that means ABC data, incident reporting. Whenever you need to do a reportable matter, you need to have evidence for that. So if someone's, for example, implementing an unauthorized restricted practice, well, where's the incident report that states that they implement that practice? And a good example would be if someone was restrained because they were at risk or they could not control their behavior, whatever it might be. It's got to be reasonable, for one, but it also then has to be reported as an unauthorized restricted practice that was implemented, or unauthorized restrictive intervention. in terms of the national context, we are looking at the RPA system, and in RPA, our priority is to create a behaviour support plan with those restrictions. Now, I just, I guess, put it out to everyone, a little bit of a Q&A. What would you do if you identified a restricted practice? What sort of documentation would you need?
Incident reports?
Incident reports part of it, but what would you need to actually develop an interim plan, and then we'll go on to
Wouldn't you request the outcome summary?
Yeah, so you're jumping ahead a little bit, Ali. We're looking at the comprehensive there. So for an interim, you don't need the outcome summary. What you need is consent. You also need to develop a protocol. Now, I've developed templates for the protocols, and a lot of organisations are asking for a separate protocol for each practice. And then what you do is just dump that into your behaviour support plan as an attachment. So all of those processes are there, and we kind of want to tidy up how we're actually doing that. So we don't just write it in the plan as, yes, they have this restriction. You've actually got to have a protocol for implementation. Now, when we get to the, yes, an incident report would be needed to demonstrate that a practice was required. You also need evidence that that organisation has started the 5-day reporting process, and there potentially might be a an interim approval which can be given company manager. So not our company, but the organisation's quality safeguard person. They can give an interim approval that day. When it comes to a comprehensive, what you need is an outcome summary with the dates of the start of the practice and expiry. And then you also need evidence of consent. Now, this is where we need to confirm who is actually responsible for consenting to the restricted practices function. And you might have seen a lot of people going through guardianship now. A requirement of the NDIS is to actually have formal guardianship in place. However, there is a flood of people going to the guardianship. So they're not too concerned about, as long as you've got a document stating that this person is the informal guardian or formal guardian, and they consent to the relevant restricted practices. So we want to get better at actually having the evidence so we can upload it to the portal as supporting evidence with the biz. So a lot of, yeah, even I've told people different things from today. This is what we want to focus on, and make sure that every time we identify a restricted practice, that we're going through the proper framework. And that means reporting unauthorized practices.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Like, I'm just sort of starting up, and I've just noticed on a previous behaviour support plan, at the very end, it's got a restricted practice of chemical restraint, which is routine psychotropic medication. So how do I find out if that's authorised or not? This is an old report.
Yeah, so later down in the slides, I've got a bit on chemical restraint, but to answer your question, the person, what we need, and the psychiatrists don't like this, but what we need is a letter from the psychiatrist.
I'll say again, you broke up there.
What we need is a letter from the psychiatrist,
okay,
stating the purpose of medication and that they've done a DSM-5 assessment.
Okay.
So this is where it kind of contradicts some people's thinking around, well, it's psychotropic medication. But what the guideline is from the NDIS Quality Safeguard Commission perspective,
yeah,
we're only reporting medication, but medication for the purpose of symptoms of behaviour.
it's for epilepsy and mood. So
Well, in what example? Say epilim. If it's an individual question, that's something I would suggest for today you send to your team leader.
All right, no worries.
And then we talk about that, because it is on an individual basis at times, but the basic example is that or even complete the biz plan until we have the documented evidence. So that would be a letter from the psychiatrist stating the purpose of medication, and then we can put it in as the chemical restraint, or we can note in the biz plan that they're on this medication, but it's for the symptoms of a mental health condition.
Sorry, you broke up there again, Dan. It's a really difficult sound connection.
It's breaking up for me as well. I just didn't want to interrupt, but yeah, I think if I don't know what it is, but it's breaking up for me a lot as well.
Okay, it might just be the connection. What I was saying was that if they are prescribed medication for behaviour, we then need to put it in the plan, but we need a letter from their psychiatrist specifically stating that they've done an assessment and this is the purpose of the medication.
Okay. Did you say you cannot do anything with the plan until that's done?
Well, I would be stalled on the plan until I get the letter.
Okay. And then that obviously takes time. Well, no, it doesn't. They can just request that.
Yeah, they can request it straight away.
All right. Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
So again, it goes back to, we want to be evidence-based. So not just a conversation with someone, they might say, oh, well, we've got a restricted practice and we use chemical on a routine basis. That's great. Can you please provide me with a letter from the psychiatrist stating the purpose of the medication and that they've done a DSM-5 assessment? Okay.
Then
So
if you've got that.
Sorry?
And then when you get that, you don't need to do the interim because it's been authorized?
No, the psychiatrist is not authorizing it. They're just providing you with evidence.
Okay, so
The plan, and then the organisation needs to put it through their RPA panel and authorise it. Okay. So if we're doing interims, most of the time it's going to have unauthorised practice. And that's where when you go to the portal, you can't actually complete a portal entry for a comprehensive plan without entering the start and end dates of the practice and when was consent provided. So you need a date for that as well. Okay. Otherwise, it's just an interim and you can put unauthorized.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying is, how do you know if it's authorized?
You would ask them for the outcome summary. If they say we haven't been through a panel yet, it's unauthorized.
Okay.
And then you need to ask them, have you reported this to the NDIS as an unauthorized practice? And you might hear a lot of people then saying, yes, we're doing the 5-day reporting. So that means they're doing that. They're doing that until that practice gets heard at their panel and then gets authorized for whatever period. The longest period of time that you can actually authorize a restriction is for 12 months.
Oh, okay. All right. Then you need to review it.
Yeah, definitely. Now, everyone must have access to the NDIS portal and also the fax portal. Because if you've put a plan together and they've now put it through their panel, you're going to get an email from fax stating that you need to endorse your plan and the restriction. Okay. But again, if you don't have that, that's something outside of this that we'll look at. Okay. I'm pretty sure everyone has that delegation at the moment. Now, panels are primary mechanism in New South Wales for approving or declining authorisations. So this is the point that if your plan doesn't demonstrate the need and evidence for the practice, they may decline it. So just because you've put it in the plan, if there's no protocol, they'll decline it. Okay. Now, in terms of definitions, I've got them on the screen there in terms of seclusion. So Commonwealth being federal, it's all the same, particularly, for all of them. What used to occur where there were some differences in these, but now they're aligning together. So we do need to report PRN medication and also routine medication if it's specifically prescribed for behavioural reasons. So and a good example is the chemical epilum or Tegretol.
Yeah.
So being prescribed that, but you don't have a diagnosis of epilepsy, that would tell me it's being used as a mood stabilizer, and I need to ask for a letter stating, is this used for behavioural reasons?
Sorry, can I ask a quick question?
Yep.
So you mentioned that the letter has to come from a psychiatrist.
Yeah, or paediatrician if it's a child.
Pediatrician. Yeah, thank you. That was it.
Yep. And we'll get on to who reports that soon. Now, when it comes to...
Sorry, before you go on, aren't GPs okay sometimes to sign off, particularly when someone's been on medication for a long time? And
if they can do it, if they can provide evidence that a DSM assessment's been done, then yeah, but most GPs are just basically renewing the prescription. My perspective is that if you're on medication for behaviour, you need to be seeing a psychiatrist. They're the ones who are completing those assessments. And this is where sometimes we're improving the service, because maybe the person has never seen a psychiatrist, but they're prescribed all these different medications, and we need a proper assessment done.
Yep.
Okay.
Yes. Yep. I just raise it because some service providers will argue that is enough. So just so
we just go back to I'm sorry, we follow the NDIS guidelines. That's part of our accreditation. We do just, if the GP can supply us with a letter that an assessment's been completed and that they are clear on the reasons for the medication, that may be sufficient. But this is where you're adding that letter to the portal as an They look through these and they will come back with questions if it doesn't seem like it's correlating. Okay. Now, seclusion. I'm going to move on to seclusion. So being is sole confinement in a room or physical space for any hour of the day or night. Voluntary exit is where voluntary exit's prevented. So we probably come across this a little bit. I know myself and Kiri and Narelle have come across the seclusion can't impact the universal human rights. They must have constant supervision, and they must have access to basic needs like food, water, toilet, and bed at all times. Now, if you identify a child's been secluded, it's actually a prohibited practice. You cannot do it. And that's under the rights of the child in terms of the UN Convention.
Does that apply to under 18 or under 16?
Under 18.
18, perfect.
The definition of a child is someone under the UN Convention for the Rights of the Child is anyone under 18.
Daniel, I've got a little bit of information in regards to the seclusion of a child. So I had to make a fax report because I had witnessed a child being locked in a room.
Yep.
In a family home, and fax reported it wasn't an issue. They declined to actually investigate it.
Okay, so this is where are we reporting it? We need to do the 5-day report, and we need to send it to the, which I'll get to later in the slides, but it's an important point to bring up now. You will have to do a 5-day report and send it to the reportable matters team in the NDIS Quality Safeguard Commission.
This is a family home though.
We still need to do it.
Okay.
Yeah, so I can work with you later on that and provide you with the reports. And I've also set up a process. So the process from now is, if anyone identifies this, you feel you need to do a 5-day report, the first one that should be notified is me in the operations role, and then David. And then we provide you with the support. And one of the big things that we need to work with you on is debriefing as well. So making sure that you're provided with the support to do the paperwork and also look at your well-being. You might come across some pretty bad things in the sector. So I'll work with you on that, David. I think that's important to notify. But just keep in mind, they must have access to basic needs and constant supervision. So I talked about chemical restraint before. And again, people might have different perspectives of this in terms of even the Therapeutic Goods Act, but we need to follow the NDIS Quality Safeguard Commission policy on this. So unless it's for the treatment of mental health or diagnosed mental disorder or physical illness or physical condition, we need to investigate a little bit further in terms of why is the medication prescribed and what is the purpose of that medication. And you'll need the doctor's name, when it was assessed, and that all needs to go onto the portal when you're uploading the plan. Have you got any questions on chemical restraint? Because I know this is a big one for people.
You still have to do it if it's in conjunction, like I've got written here, epilepsy and mood. Is
the mood.
Oh, that's still a restrictive practice.
Yeah, I need that letter stating what is the medication prescribed for.
Okay.
And the answer is yes, if it's 50-50.
Yeah.
I asked the commission the same question. I had exactly the same. The purpose, epilepsy and mood. And they said better off putting it on the portal as a restricted practice, unless the psychiatrist is willing to change that.
And they do an assessment. Now, I've also put down in the footnotes that anyone providing support who's administering medication, they must have the MIMS medication identification information resource in the folder on site. So anytime there's medication around, you need the identification and information form. So this is all stuff that we'd be educating providers about. Some of them do it really well, and it's just part of their policy. Others don't have it. So just keep in mind too, that everything we're talking about is to be implemented by a provider, not the family. Okay, so the family don't report to the NDIS Commission. If we need to put it in the plan as the family implementing a practice, we still report to the rather than load it to the portal. Okay, and that would be to the NDIS Commission, which again, if you come across those issues, you talk to your team leader or myself or David, and we support you through that process. Now, PRN medication definitely is a restricted practice, unless it's like Panadol for pain. Okay, so you need to write a protocol, but you're not developing the protocol in detail. You're just transferring the information and putting some general medication guidelines in from the PRN protocol developed by the psychiatrist. Okay, so they will tell you what's the maximum dose within 24 hours. They'll tell you timeframes between. That should all be on the letter from the doctor. If I'm asked to do a PRN protocol without that, I'm saying I can't write one. I'm just writing the protocol for the staff as per the psychiatrist's recommendations. Okay. Any more questions? I know there's probably lots of questions, but any questions on chemical restraint while we're here?
I have one quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I've asked you this before, but when we're looking through the different medications, we sort of can Google and have a pretty good idea about what is used for what. But is there a more specific and in-depth list of things that are classified as chemical restraint?
They are on the portal, but my rule is I don't Google any of the medication. I get the doctor's letter. And if I feel that I need more answers, I request more information.
Right.
So again, we're not the ones we're not the ones prescribing it. We're not even administering it. We're the ones who are detailing in the plan, and we're the ones signing that plan off. So we need to make sure that the information we have is correct. So it's okay to push back on a plan and finishing it if you don't have the information. Okay, you've just got to have the rationale as to why. And obviously request particular bits of information to help with the finalization of that plan.
And if we figure out that somebody is using chemical restraint, how long are they allowed to stay on that medication waiting for the whole procedure to occur?
I guess it's a different way of looking at it. They can stay on the medication, but the organisation has to immediately do the 5-day reporting for an unauthorised practice.
Okay.
Okay. But we always go back to, what did the psychiatrist say? Where is the letter?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to add, Polly, also when I started, I was, it's easy to take on a lot of responsibility, and that's not our responsibility. Our responsibility is to report. And just to give you an example, one client that I had done the comprehensive plan like 4 or 5 months ago. We knew that it was a restrictive practice, but I had not received a letter stating what the purpose of that medication was for. I had, been very proactive and created the plan on the portal, etc., and it was in draft like for 4 months. And I ended up emailing the commission, just advising them.
You're dropping out.
You dropped out, Kiri. I think it's because a lot of people are on connection.
This has been in draft for that long.
You've actually dropped out for about 20 seconds. So
Sorry,
you've emailed the commission. You've dropped out for about 20
Yeah, I'll explain. So what happens is that...
okay, you do it. I have a bad connection.
Yeah. When that was occurring and we were waiting for information, we need to be proactive. And part of that is even sending the draft plan we've got to the commission via email stating why we're not uploading it, because we're waiting on information.
Okay.
So it's okay to do that, but again, evidence-based. You might have to produce emails and things like that where you've requested it, so that they have the evidence.
Okay.
I want everyone to really, I guess, think of the commission as the central point of information for people with restricted practices. So the commission, they're the central point. Right? I kind of liken it to when I was working at ADAC, that they become the central filing system and data system. And I know if I wanted to search for something, I go to that, and then all the information's there. And this is the thing, we're trying to build on the evidence base for people. So I want to move on to mechanical restraint. And there's a few things which we've clarified. Georgena and myself have been working a lot with the commission recently to clarify, and we've given them scenarios and everything. And one of the things that they were clear on is that a vehicle screen is not a restricted practice, even though previously it was. Okay, their perspective is that the person should not be in the front while someone's driving or accessing the front. Okay, so that's one that we don't need to report. We still put it in the plan, but it's not something you need to report on the portal in terms of a mechanical restraint.
Should we bother talking about this, or?
Yes, we should.
Surprise to me.
We should, because it comes up a lot lately. But in terms,
it's my understanding, or even just from chats with you, anything after market, and I was telling on the other last week, anything that's installed market, that was kind of a but measure is a restrictive practice.
Yeah,
not spoilers.
But as of this, without clarification, they've stated it is not.
Yep. Okay. That's good to know.
So again, this is new. I personally would have thought it always has been, but they're saying after clarification again this week, they're saying it's the vehicle screen itself is not. Okay. Now, what mechanical restraint does include is any device used to manage the person's behavior. A therapeutic or non-behavioral purpose for, say, a travel harness. So if someone has epilepsy and they're prone to seizure activity, and they are at risk of falling out of their seat due to a seizure, and they need a vehicle harness to hold them up for postural reasons, that is not restricted practice. Okay. Now, if someone uses a harness because they're going to go out and grab someone or attack them in the vehicle, now it's a restricted practice. And we've got to look at the purpose of all of these devices.
And then the purpose of those devices, like the psychiatrists need to give the purpose for medication, would that be an OT report?
OT assessment and report. Yep. And in the vehicle, if there's any vehicle device, say like a buckle guard or harness, we also requirements, you need to have a letter from the GP stating that this device is required, and that letter stays in the vehicle. They also need to have a seatbelt cutter. They need to have a sticker on the vehicle in case of an accident, and they need to be recording on their travel log each time that person is in the vehicle using the device. So there's a few general things that they need to follow just around the RMS. So do you have any burning issues, questions on mechanical restraint?
Just to clarify, because I haven't had a mechanical restraint like that before. So you actually need to, whenever a mechanical restraint is identified, you have to get a report from the OT as well as the GP?
No, the GP is just giving you that letter stating, yes, this device is required for travel, and person's safety or whatever the reason is, and that stays in the vehicle. Now, the OT should be assessing the need for the device, and generally the OT is the one prescribing the device. So like buckle guards, harnesses, because they need to test all this stuff out and see what's the best fit and what's the most effective. Now, I'll give you another example. Like at the bottom here, we've got including disabling electric wheelchairs. I've got one person at the moment that he will take control of his electric wheelchair and start ramming people, and staff have an authorized restricted practice to turn his wheelchair off. So effectively that person can't, we've taken away the liberty to move. So that becomes a restricted practice, okay? And that's needed for him, otherwise people will get injured. Is there any more questions on mechanical restraint? Look, I'm expecting this is just an ongoing conversation. Today we're just presenting the basics, and RPAs is, you know, a key point of what we do. Is there any mechanical restraint questions? No. Okay. I'll move on. So now we're looking at physical restraint. So physical restraint is use or action of physical force to prevent, restrict, or subdue movement of a person's body or part of their body for the primary purpose of influencing their behavior. So it does not include use of hands-on techniques, say hand over hand. So you might be assisting someone to feed. That's not a restricted practice. But as soon as you stop that person's ability to move about, now it potentially is a restricted practice. And it's not a restricted practice if you're using, say, for instance, a combination like a physical restraint and a mechanical restraint in terms of, say, a pelican belt for transfers. If that's used just for mobility, what we need is a manual handling plan for that person. And that's not a restricted practice because it's helping the person to move about and transfer all those different things. This one I've years been teaching physical restraint, and I hope that it's becoming less and less in the sector. What's everyone's, I guess, exposure to physical restraint?
Where hugs, I've had a client whose support workers were under the impression that they can firmly hug the person, you know, for safety reasons, or if the person's becoming physically abusive to other people. And And
Definitely a RPA. Are you there, Rosa?
yes, sorry. Yes, it is an RPA. Was that the question? An example of?
So you've dropped out as well.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Yep.
Okay, perfect. Yes, and that's what I advise the support coordinator and the not the support coordinator, sorry, the team leader of the like the support workers, that this is definitely an RPA and needs to be reported to the commission. They didn't really like that and stopped emailing me after that.
Okay, so this is the thing too. If you know it's occurring, we need to do a 5-day report to the commission. So there might be a few reports we need to do in the next week or so, just to tidy up where we're at with people's supports. But again, we need an incident report. When did this occur? How was it done? Are others trained to implement physical restraint? Because the thing with physical restraint is that it needs to be, as much as possible, non-pain compliant. So if you're using pain or implementing some sort of strategy that uses pain to physically restrain someone, it's a prohibited practice and it's actually assault. So this is where we need to report it, and then another investigation will occur. Potentially police will be involved. Okay.
Sure.
So even though they think, oh, it might be for safety, if you're using pain compliance, you're actually assaulting the person.
So if we are, so in other words, if we are sort of holding them so tightly that, you know, that it's that the person feels physically,
Pain.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah, that's assault.
Yes.
So just in the definition of physical restraint and also the definition of assault. Okay, and this is, yeah, a lot of you haven't done MABO part or NVCI courses. I think it's important that as your own self development that you actually go on these courses. And I've said to a few people as well, if you've never worked in a group home, maybe you go and get a shifts in complex units, and that'll help you to really understand how to develop behaviour support plans a lot better as well, because you're on the ground and you're seeing it, you're experiencing it, and you can then have that empathy on the other side with how staff are dealing with it and helping them to put strategies in place as well. So physical restraint's one we need to be really aware of, and we need to report that straight away if we are aware that that is occurring. Any questions on physical restraint?
Yeah, just a question.
I'm just aware of it. Try and get 30 slides.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Just the example that Rosa gave. What if a hug it is kind of identified as kind of therapeutic, you know, gets the person back in their body or something? Again, I don't know.
Well, the difference there is therapeutically, you would be giving a hug, would be doing that potentially. As soon as that person resists and you continue to hug, now we're looking at a physical restraint, which may have a therapeutic element to it. But I would be very careful about writing that up until we've got all the information, we've observed it, and we have a protocol for that, and the staff are trained, because they need to be trained on when to let go.
Yep.
And when does that become therapeutic and when does it become restraint? And that's the definition in those areas as well. Sorry, Steve just jumped on, I saw. Steve, you got any comments around physical restraint, being a trainer as well?
G'day.
Hey.
Physical restraint. Yeah, I mean, obviously, when I'm writing plans, if I know that people have had some kind of training, whether it's part MABO or MAPA, one thing I'm very careful about is, I don't know if this is relevant to the conversation. I just jumped in the back of it, but I'm never actually going to put pictures of the restraint or detailed instructions on how the restraint should look, because the danger in that is that that's going to be seen as you providing training. And if you're providing training outside of licensing agreements with MAPA and all that, then you're taking liability rather than that organisation potentially taking liability if it turns out that one of these things is misused. I think that's an important thing to note as well. But obviously the way you restrain, when you release, how you release, these are all important parts of restraint that a part of what the training would provide. Yeah,
exactly right. And another, I guess, thing to add there too, when I write up these protocols, there's disclosures all over them that we're not taking responsibility, that they need to be trained. This is the organisation who does it.
Yeah.
But another key part of physical restraint is staff and the person must have access to debriefing immediately after the restraint.
Absolutely.
Which is one thing that people don't do. They just do the restraint and go, oh, he's calming down now. Well, everyone actually needs to have a documented debriefing process around that. So for everyone, I don't know anyone else that has the experience apart from myself and Steve. If you've come across someone who does have a physical restraint protocol or practice or unauthorized practice, I would suggest you speak to one of us about this first before you do any sort of documentation.
Yeah.
And even to problem solve, where do we go to next with it? How are they going to get trained? What is the debriefing pro? What is the effect? Now, this is the thing we're talking about RPAs, but part of our role is to create and assess and develop the functional behavior assessment. So we need to look at things like physical restraint and how does that affect the person's behavior and relationship with their support network.
Totally.
So there's all of this stuff that we're talking about will flow into your reports, will flow into your assessments, particularly around the function of the behavior. I work with people that will intentionally engage in extreme self-harm, extreme property damage, and extreme assault so that they get restrained, so that they have physical contact. So that's actually meeting their own personal need to have physical contact, but the way they're going about it is totally inappropriate. And that's where you will assess why is the person doing this and then try and replace it with a better behavior or a safer behavior. So all of these are important to note. We're looking at just the reporting side of things at the moment. It's also to your behavior assessment and everything else that you do in terms of skills programs. So it becomes really complex. We're talking RPAs. It's pretty serious. So we're going to move on to environmental restraints now. Now, environmental restraints, obviously, not only restricting the person's movement, restricted access to a particular item, but also an area or activity. Now, another one which I've clarified with the Commission, if someone has parole conditions and they must be within line of sight, that becomes an environmental restraint as well. So you need to refer back to their parole condition. And if they must stay, I'll give you an example. If someone leaves support and the staff's guideline then is to call the parole officer or the police when they can't see them anymore, that now becomes an environmental restraint. So there's a few that are kind of a little out there depending on the client group or population that you're working with. Other examples would be locked premises, locked wardrobes, so restricted access to clothing, sharps, food, pantries, lots of different things. Sorry, someone was about to say something?
Yeah, if that's in a family home, if, like, for example, a parent said you're not going to use the iPad until you've done your homework, and they remove that item and the item's locked, or how does that fit in with?
So that still goes into the plan, but if it's in the family home and the family implementing it, that's when you email the behaviour support plan to the Commission rather than putting it onto the portal.
Okay.
So they still need to be notified of it, but the family's obviously not going to report that. Now that gives you an opportunity to look at why is the parent doing that, and is there an alternative or a replacement strategy that you could put in place that gives the person the freedom to access that iPad, and to have a different strategy for them to give up the iPad at certain times when they're doing another activity. So the RPAs to me give you an opportunity to develop replacement behaviors and strategies.
Okay.
Because you've identified what the risk is. And sometimes it's better off to go higher level in terms of putting the restriction in place to then fade it out. And with all of these practices, the key perspective of the commission is, what are you doing to fade the practice out? So you want to eliminate it over time.
Okay.
Could I ask something, Daniel?
Sure.
So with the current medical situation and the whole idea of staying home, not mixing in larger groups, if we are faced, or if clients are faced with a situation where they need to stay home and not go about their usual activities, would that be considered as an environmental restraint?
No, because what we also need to look at is what is a standard community practice.
Right.
Now, this also brings up an important point around people needing a restriction at potentially at night time. Well, the commission is actually saying, well, what is the community standard? Most people would lock their door at night. Now, if you've got someone trying to leave at night time and there are behaviours of concern observed, you need an incident report, and we need to look at that practice a little bit more, just to make sure that all the correct reporting's in place. But generally, we're looking at, is this a community standard?
I guess it would, in that kind of case, it would depend on the nature of the lock as well. Like if you have a door lock on your front door, which you can't open from the inside, and that would be the case regardless, then that would be a community standard. You're locking your door, it's for security. But like I can get out of my front door without a key, right? Because that's the nature of the locks that are on my door. Someone can't get in, but I can get out. And if I were to change that so that I could not get out, then I'll be doing that for a different reason.
Yeah, exactly right. And it does come down to, I can't stress enough, it's all individual. And then we also need to look at, how does that person's restriction influence or impact on the other people that they live with? So maybe they don't need it, the other person doesn't need a restriction, but they do need a biz plan stating that this practice is in there for someone else and it affects them. So you have to be working with one person's house who you're doing a biz plan for, but no one else has one. And that person you're working with has restrictions, environmental restrictions in place that affect everyone else. That to me then actions everyone else needs potentially a biz plan. But again, case by case basis, and we need to individualize everything around the generalized legislation. So one of the big things that's come up is food. If food's restricted, yes, we need to put a restricted practice in place. And we need to know why it's there. Is it because of overconsumption? Is it because of hygiene risks? There could be a number of issues there. Any more questions on environmental? No? Have a look at the next slide around where restricted practice is considered. I mentioned line of sight in terms of managing behaviours of concern, which could be absconding and engaging in inappropriate behaviour or assault, or even sexualised behaviour. Could be a number of reasons there. Another reason, or another 3 reasons why restricted practices would be required: electronic monitoring devices. So that could be, ankle bracelets or things like that when we're talking about people coming out of jail and their conditions. CCTV or other surveillance, there's a restriction that's required there. And extended supervision orders, which not many of you would come across unless you're working in the justice system. But these are all considered as regulated restricted practices.
Hey, Daniel, I have a question about the CCTV.
Yes.
So I have a house where they all have units externally from communal area. They've all got restricted practices that they can't leave their units without support. The CCTV is purely the communal areas. And I'm just wondering, do I need to actually put that in as an RP?
Well, you'd need to put in the RP because they can't leave without staff support.
Well, that's a completely different. I'm just worried about the CCTV in general.
I personally would include the CCTV as part of it.
Okay.
And then just as long as it's noted, but we'd need to look individually. How is that affecting why is the CCTV there? And definitely it can't be in personal spaces. If it is in personal spaces, definitely you need a restricted practice.
Well, to one of the clients I work with in the house, the CCTV does see into his backyard, but nothing else.
Okay, we'd probably have to look at that a little bit closer outside of here.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah, definitely can help you with that, but again, this is what I was saying to everyone. It is an individual basis, but there are guidelines. Now, in terms of function of restraint, you can look at that yourself. We're looking at even medication. How has that been prescribed? Now, another one that has come up for me recently was someone who's been hospitalized and they actually needed to keep the bed rails up at all times. That then fell into a restricted practice. Okay, because if he put his feet on the ground, he's a potentially risk of broken. So sometimes in a hospital setting, you might need to put that in as well, just so that we're reporting that to the commission. So again, it's an evidence base. And we just want to make sure that we're reporting in the correct way. If they come back and say you don't need to report it, that's fine. At least you've done your part and you've identified it as a potential restriction. And we do have some assessment tools, but I think it's best that you speak to, if you're unsure, you speak to myself, David, or your team leader to make sure that you're looking at the right areas in terms of the restriction. Now, this area I want to definitely look at in terms of prohibited practices. So aversion, so any practice which might be experienced by a person as noxious or unpleasant or potentially painful. So that might even go back to pain compliant restraint. It's a prohibited practice and falls into the assault range. Now, it depends on how long you've been in the sector or what you've been exposed to, but I've seen most of this stuff being done and we've had to report it. We've had to remove staff, and staff have also been charged for assault when it came to them using aversion. One of the, I guess, best and worst examples I've got is it was on a hot day and someone with cerebral palsy in a wheelchair. The staff had a spray gun, like a water gun, and they said, oh, I'm just misting his face. But what they were doing was had it on the harder setting and they were intentionally spraying him in the eye with it, and he didn't like it. So that's aversion. It's a prohibited practice, and it was negatively affecting the person. Other ones might be misuse of medication. I've got an example of that yesterday where PRN was used, diazepam, when someone was escalated. However, they've not had PRN diazepam for 9 months. It's not in their plan. And I'm asking where they got the medication from. So it shouldn't have even been on site. And this is important. If you remove a practice like PRN, you must email, state to them saying you need to dispose of the medication. It can't be on site anymore, because misuse of medication is definitely an issue in the sector. When you've got unskilled staff, people with different ideas of what should work and what practices should be in place, you just want to make sure that everything's correct in that support system. So if that medication is not needed, it's not on site. So then there's no room for error. Now, a few other prohibited practices we talked about, seclusion of children or young people, denial of key needs, so like preventing access to family, peers, advocates, basic supports or needs, if there isn't a particular condition in place, like say an AVO or something like that. Another prohibited practice, unauthorized use of an RP, especially if the staff know it's not approved, it definitely falls then into the prohibited practices. So have you any questions on that? Because I know people, especially if you're new to the sector, you might walk into a place and go, what's going on here? Any questions on prohibited practices?
I'm all good here.
No?
I'm all good, thank you.
I'm not going to go too much into the next few slides, but everyone's got access to it now. So if you've got questions, just email me. Make sure you CC David and Gina in as well, or just CC the whole team and make it a team response. So we're looking at crisis response and critical incidents. This one we're going to kind of park for a little bit because we need to spend a lot more time when it comes to talking about non-purposeful risk. Community justice programs have a different view in terms of what non-purposeful is compared to facts, compared to the NDIS. So just keep in mind, we follow the NDIS framework. And that's our key responsibility. And there's a little bit more around non-purposeful practice. There will be some updates in terms of restricted practices around safe transportation. So I'll give you an example. Say for instance, the person's got a buckle guard because they play around with the seatbelt and it comes undone. But there's no behavioural, I guess, aspect to that in terms of them trying to attack people, walk around the vehicle. That would be a non-purposeful practice and not a restricted practice. It still needs to be in the BIS plan as a behaviour of concern, but it's not something we need to report on to the Commission. There will be a lot of updates coming out in the next month or so from the Commission. Now, this might also include therapeutic devices. Again, we just need to make sure that it's effective, it's relevant, it's in the plan, and it definitely doesn't have a behavioural element to it. Now, there's some more on I guess, assessing behaviours of concern during transport. So a few examples where you would require a restricted practice is the person's like getting up, hitting windows, seats or other people, trying to unlock the doors and attempting to get out whilst being driven. Might be a person trying to abscond or whatever it might be. Signs of protests as well. But again, case-by-case basis. And we need to do the functional behaviour assessment in the vehicle as well. So where you've got, for instance, behaviours that staff are stating are happening in different environments, you should be doing an assessment on each different environment where that occurs. So if the person's saying, oh, well, they're aggressive at home with the people they live with, the assessment needs to consider that environment. And then they might say, oh, but they do this in the vehicle. You now need to travel with the person and assess that as it occurs as well, and look at incident reports and all your supporting documentation.
So Daniel, how does that, sorry Daniel, how does that work when the behaviours of concern they like intermittent?
What do you mean?
Kathy. Yeah.
Okay.
So if I've got a client that she does intermittent escaping out of the vehicle, so they've put child locks on, but it's not a consistent behaviour. So if I was to go and do a functional assessment of that, there's probably a high chance that I'm not going to actually witness it. So how does that work?
Look, I would suggest you go for a drive with a person. If you observe it or not, you still write down your observations, but you would be looking at your incident reporting.
Okay.
So what incident reports have demonstrated that this is a concern?
Okay.
So we don't just say, oh, well, not that I know you wouldn't do this, but just saying, oh, we didn't see it, so it's not a restriction. Well, there's evidence there, so we need to include that.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
And I've got people who exhibit high range, extreme behaviours of concern, yet I go to meet them and I'll be doing it consistently and I'm not seeing anything. So it's kind of, me and Steve talked about this recently as well. It could be like the white coat syndrome. There is a whole theory around, even when you implement ABC data, that the behaviours seem to cease. And I think it's more about, I'd have to find it, the paper for you, but it is more around the support system being more aware of the behaviour now and actually implementing strategies at early intervention. So yeah, sometimes you're not going to see the behaviour. So you need to look at what other evidence is there to suggest that it might be a restriction or that a strategy might be needed.
There's some recent research that I'm aware of as well that that talks about practice leadership. So talking about someone who's in a level of seniority within a setting, and they've given a condition in their research about that person being present but not actually doing anything. And the simple presence of someone in leadership capability being in an environment increases implementation fidelity.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And you kind of get complaints from staff sometimes. They're like, "Oh, he does it all the time when you're not here."
Yeah.
Well, okay. It could be my presence. It could just be the fact they understand hierarchy or clinicians or therapists.
Yeah.
You've just got to use whatever evidence you can, Kathy, in terms of incident reports, ABC data, all that.
It's that little magic wand we always carry around with us.
Oh yeah, that one. Yeah,
freezes of behaviour.
I forgot about that one. Yeah. Keep looking more on this. Does that kind of answer your question, Kathy, though?
Yes, that's fine. That's what I'd sort of worked on doing anyway, but I just wanted to check.
Yep. And there's some other information there continued around different legislations. We've got to also remember that I've had this recently where someone's transferred to a different state. So we need to start researching the different legislation like Victoria or Queensland. And there is slight differences there around reporting. Okay.
Are Queensland still only considering restricted practice for adults?
Yes, they are.
Yeah, ridiculous.
Yeah. So there's some, it's not consistent, even though it's a national framework. The restricted practices side of things is not consistent.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go through this one, but you can have a look at some ideas on functional behaviour assessment in vehicles. CPs versus purposeful. Again, we're funded by the NDIS, so we need to report to the NDIS around the guidelines. There might be differences though. Sometimes it's kind of pick and choose your battles around the conversations you have. You might just talk to the consenter and the person or the support network and say, look, we need to report this as part of our guidelines and our accreditation requirements. Now, risk assessment and management plans. There's some, the 5 components there. So documented plan based on assessment of causes and factors, identifying risk behavior, plans identify risk of what and to whom. So is it to the person? Is it to others? Is it to staff? You need to include all those specifics. Strategies to minimize the risk. And again, when we're talking about restricted practices, the end goal is, can we fade the practice out? So can we totally remove it? If we can't, what's the rationale? Why can't we? Is it because of the person's level of ability, understanding? There's a whole lot of things that you would list in there. But even with people you think you can't remove the practices, I can pretty much guarantee we can modify it to a point where it's least restrictive. So if you think of those two terms, can I fade the practice out or can I change the practice to be least restrictive? That's the perspective of the Quality Safeguard Commission and basic human rights as well. Now, if you've got restrictions in place too, and they've got a behaviour support plan, it is important to note that that plan needs to be, well, all behaviour support plans, the validity on those is 12 months, okay? So they need an annual review. If behaviours change, you need a review again within that 12-month period. Yeah, there's some, you can see the link there for processes on YouTube. Portal and authorization. This is something that Kiri's talked a lot about. And it's just making sure that you have all the information that's necessary in the portal. If you're attaching your plan and it's not a necessary part to add, then you can just say refer to plan or write a very brief detail in that.
Quick question,
So, Polly?
Daniel. Yeah.
Yep.
Would we ever recommend to increase restrictive practices, specifically chemical restrictive practices, or is that not our place? Would we just send the client back to the psychiatrist to review their behaviour?
I personally would never say increase medication. I'd be like, can we get this reviewed? Can we get the person's behaviour or the issue reviewed with the psychiatrist? I'm never making that call at all. It's just not something I'm qualified to do and not comfortable to do as well. I've had people say, oh, do you think we should add a PRN? I said, I think you should go to the psychiatrist and talk to them about it. Give them the evidence, give them the data, and give them the reason. I went to a psychiatrist meeting the other day, and I actually had the videos of the person self-harming, and they actually made the call and said, yeah, we need PRN for this.
Yeah.
So, you know, they're the ones making the decision. What your job is, the way I look at your role is you're an information gatherer. You're a storyteller. You're the person who's putting it all together to give the other qualified people and treatment teams a better understanding of who that person is. Now, that also includes your lifestyle plan. You know, one big key element around a person-centered plan, how does the restriction affect that person's self-esteem, their well-being, their feelings of safety? You know, imagine, and this is a common one when it comes to physical restraint, how would you feel? And look, I used to test this out in staffing groups. I was a bit of a idiot sometimes with this, but it proved a point. They're saying, oh, but we have to restrain the person. I said, okay, we're going to practice restraint now. We're going to do a 2-man escorted restraint and go to a prone restraint with 5 people, which is what they wanted for this person. So I put the person into it, and they said, okay, I'm done now. I said, no, you're not done. You're not getting out. And I had a session 2 minutes before that with the people who were restraining, saying, when I tell you to let go, let go. But at this point, you're not letting go. You need to feel what it's like to be in a restraint and you have no control. And it was a controlled environment. I'm not saying I'd do this with everyone. I knew the person who was in the restraint. It was controlled, and we did debriefing after it. So, but if we're implementing these types of practices, I think the best way to understand how that person feels is actually to be in their shoes. So it's easy to say, let's put the restriction in place. But if we're being person-centered, how can we be least restrictive? Do we even need the restriction? You know, I've increased staffing levels with some people through funding and then removed the restriction. And that was for an example of locked doors during the day. I said, well, you've got 2 staff. One of you can go with them. Oh, but they'll run off. I said, not if you're going with them. You've still got them in line of sight and you're understanding the risk. So where we can increase supports and reduce restriction, that's a good thing. Report to the commissions there, and it clearly states there, families are not a registered NDIS provider, so they're not reporting on a monthly basis or even 5-day reports to the commission. We're just supplying the plan, and the commission is just notified that this practice is occurring. And that can then also be discussed at their planning meeting as well. Also increase staffing levels and supports for them. So our end goal is to look at how do we improve quality of life for people and how do we improve the support system. That's our key perspective. And there's some information there around exactly what I talked about. Needs to be in the biz plan, and you need to notify. FACTS do not need to authorize the practice. You just need to notify the NDIS. Quality safeguard. Now, there's a lot of people I've come across and some people I've supported on the team who are coming across providers who aren't registered. So this is where you need to state to them you need to go to the commission and get registered. Otherwise, you can't be providing support, and it's very difficult to then complete the plan with all those details on restricted practices when you can't find the provider and you can't find the outlet. So they can go through the accreditation process and just get all that in order. I'm not going to talk too much about that one. So what are you obligated to report? So in terms of your responsibilities as a practitioner, you need to do the reportable incident for death of a person with a disability. We've had been notified of that for 2 people in the last month that we'd worked with, that actually I'd worked with. So that just goes straight through to David, and he just makes a report to the Commission that we're aware it's occurred. We're obviously not running group homes and things like that. Where that occurs in a group home, there'll be an investigator, and they'll look at the circumstances and making sure that obviously medical officers have done an autopsy and things like that. Serious injury of a person with a disability. Now that could be from client to client, client to staff, or staff to client as well. Abuse and neglect of a person with a disability. So that could be locking someone in a room, taking away their basic needs. There could be a lot of things that unlawful sexual or physical contact with or assault of a person with a disability. Now that could also be client to client or staff on client.
Any of these things, could that also be serious injury as a result of damaging property and, you know, cutting yourself on glass or something? Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Just add that. You see, the good thing about consultants, everything's always a work in progress. So I've just added that in there. So going back to there, sexual misconduct committed against or in the presence of a person with a disability, that includes grooming of the person for sexual activity. So where we're aware of this, we also need to report. Basically, I look at this as anything I'm thinking might be inappropriate. I need to investigate it further and say, well, is it a reportable matter? 9 times out of 10, it's going to be. And also then the unauthorized use of restricted practices in relation to the person with disability. So that's where we need to report that through the reportable incidents to the reportable incidents team through their email, not through the portal. Okay. And that's what I've clarified with them and Gina as well. And that's our process. We feed it up to me and David. We support you to do the report, and then it goes through to the commission.
And then how about
put the protocol here.
Sorry.
No, go.
How about if all that previous list that you had and it relates to another person, another client, but we're not working with that client? How do we go about reporting? Yeah,
so again, you feed it up to myself or David or whoever's in those roles. It's not so much me or David, it's the clinical operations manager or CEO. They're the ones that you need to report it to. And then we need to speak to the organisation and state that we're actually reporting that because we witnessed it. Okay, or a disclosure was made to us. So part of our reporting is disclosures or witnessing the event. And these are all legal, I guess, terms and requirements that we have to follow. But we need to know the person who's impacted, describe the immediate response. We do the 5-day report, description in the reportable incident form, whether or not other authorities are involved. We might need to say a police event number. There could be other information we need to gather. Our own file note documentation, and also completing our own incident report, which will come into the 5-day reporting guideline. And just in the notes section here, if everyone can see it, there is the reportable incidents email, okay? But I can't stress enough, you don't do anything until you've spoken to us about it first, okay? As soon as you see it. So not 5 days later or 10 days later. When you see it that day, you need to do an incident report on the CRM and you need to talk to us about that. And then we'll guide you through it and do the debriefing as well, because you might see some pretty out there stuff.
So Dan, because we're reporting this to the NDIS, is it right to say that this would be if we'd noticed this when the person was under the support of a provider, or would we also need to do this in the case that they were, say, in a family home or a school?
Yeah, exactly. We'd still do it the same. Again, it doesn't go on the portal. It just goes to the reportable matters team, and they're the ones who then have the information, and they can make the decision to investigate or not.
Okay.
I think we're nearly up to slide 32. We've only got a few minutes left, or 10 minutes. Uploading risk to the portal. Again, I've just spoken about that. And one key element here I can't stress enough, because I guess I've been there, guys, and I know how important it is to get debriefing. You need to look after yourself first, and we need to support you on how you support your clients. It's very, very important you look at debriefing. And it is actually, there's no, you don't even consider it. It's just part of your that you engage in debriefing processes. Okay, we've got a responsibility to you to make sure that you're safe and that your well-being's in check. Now, reportable incidents, I'm going to just do a few questions for the last 10 minutes. So this is to everyone, jump in when you're ready. What happens when practitioners identify RPs are being used, but approval has not been obtained, especially in cases that you can see it's necessary for safety for the participant? What would you do? Steve, you can't answer this.
So Daniel, this is where you would do the 5-day reporting.
Yeah, what would you do first though?
But I also had a question about this because in our big training day where everyone was present, you guys mentioned that we give them a chance first to report themselves.
Yeah, whilst we're doing the reporting.
Okay, because I didn't know that.
Okay.
Like, I don't know if that was clear.
Yeah, and that's why we've developed this. And from today, it's clear that we've got the PowerPoint here. We've got the information. I've run through it. We've also had clarification on certain things in the last few weeks. So just from today, this is what we're doing. Okay.
And would that be the same for any other incidences? So if I had a past incident of all of the reportable things that you said about like property destruction or, you know, any of those behaviors that you guys mentioned, is that also just from today?
What do you mean property destruction? Like if you witness it?
Yeah, if you do witness it, or you, the support coordinator lets you know that there was sexual misconduct or anything like that. So we still have to report now if it was a past event, or is this only applicable going forward?
Right now, forward, we'll talk about this outside of this because sexual misconduct definitely. But when it comes to property damage, if they're with a provider, they would be reporting it. But if it affects you directly or you've witnessed it, you need to do an incident report on the CRM.
Okay.
Okay. So anyone else, what do you think you would do for a reportable incident? There's a few gaps we talked about.
Get consent.
Get consent.
No,
we don't need consent.
No.
Nope. So if it's a reportable incident, the process is you notify myself or the operations manager or the CEO, David, as soon as possible. We do the incident report, we gather all the information, and we do the 5-day reporting guideline and email it over to the reportable incident team. Okay.
I guess if we see that it's the restricted practice is necessary, we'll have to update the plan to include that restricted practice.
Yep, and we'll need some incident reports and evidence for that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, but definitely we don't need consent to do a reportable matter. Because I can tell you if we ask the consenter and it's to do with them, they'll say, I don't give you consent. So this is just part of our guideline as in terms of our accreditation and basic human rights and advocating for those. Now, the scenarios. So I've got a few here, and I'll just read them out. You tell me yes or no. But accommodation provider locks the door. They report residents do not request access to leave and do not attempt to leave the premises. They assert if a resident wants to leave the premises, they would assist them. Not an RP. Let's go with the next one. We've actually put the answers in there for you. So staff store chemicals in a lockable cupboard and are concerned that residents may unintentionally ingest them. Why? It's not an RP, but why would it not be a restricted practice?
Wouldn't it be because you're looking at like, that's kind of just a community standard that like you wouldn't have them accessible to that extent if they're chemicals and like prescribed medications?
Yeah, and most group homes would have like a chemical, like an MSR form or something. They'd have the chemical registration form, and you lock them up as a general. It's a work health safety element. Now that also includes medication. Medication locked away in a stored cupboard is not a restricted practice, and it's actually of the organisation to lock up medication. Unless the person's like self-administering. And even then you need to assess the risk around that and their ability to do that. So look, I'm not going to go through all of them just because of time. We've put the answers there for you to look at. If you do have any other questions, let us know. And particularly around like the harnesses, the environmental. Another one that's come up with a few people is and I've had other practitioners go into the place and say, oh, well, it is a restricted practice. It's not. The staff office being locked is not a restricted practice. We've talked about the barrier screen. There's a few around, these are where it is a restricted practice. Facility locks the front door, residents attempt to leave and the door stops them from doing this. There's significant risk if the person leaves without staff support. Definitely practice. Persons prescribed routine psychotropic medication to manage disorder, diagnose mental illness, however, is also to manage behaviours. And is it a symptom of the mental illness? If yes, it's not a restricted practice. Now, residents, this is one I threw in yesterday because I've had it twice this week. Has everyone heard of androgen before?
No.
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 So androgen is it's a chemical restraint to reduce libido. So it's like chemical castration. It is definitely a restricted practice. Now this one actually needs special authorization from the guardianship tribunal. And it's usually an injection on a fortnightly or monthly basis. And the chemical name you'll see is androgen. So the GP definitely can't prescribe that. That's a psychiatrist with a full treatment team, and it needs special authorization from the guardianship tribunal. And it needs to be reported as unauthorized with a 5-day report if it's not already authorized. There's a few other scenarios, yeah.
In relation to if the behaviour is a part of mental health issues, it seems to me that a lot of behaviours would be a part of mental health issues.
Oh, direct, yeah. But you've got to look at direct symptoms, and that's where it's an individualized approach. You need the letter from the doctor to basically support what you're doing in terms of your plan development.
But just because it is a symptom of a mental health issue doesn't mean it's not a restrictive practice.
No, generally, that's the general guideline. But like I said, everything we do in RPAs is individualized. Okay, and you need to have that communication with the treating team, and they need to provide you with that information. Okay. I can tell you a lot of psychiatrists got together late last year and lobbied the NDIS stating the chemical restraints are ridiculous, and that got knocked back. So we still need to report as per the NDIS guidelines. Now, with the continued scenarios, this come up a bit and people were a bit confused about because previously, was it October last year? Previous to October last year, you did have to report a restricted practice for the use of PRN medication for dental and medical appointments to enable medical treatment. This now just gets noted in the plan and is part of the routine medication on site. So it's not a restricted practice. And I'm sure a lot of people have got that with a few people, especially coming from the large residential centres where they use medication prior to a medical appointment on a PRN basis to sedate them so that they can get the medical procedure completed. Now that also is only if the staff are implementing it. If they go to the doctor and the doctor gives it to them, we don't need to report the RPA. We just put it in the plan that the doctor is administering the medication. prior to the medical, or prior to the procedure.
I'll just, Dan.
There's a few other ones there around food and things like that, especially around Prader-Willi syndrome, where
Can I ask a question, Dan? I think it's...
I can hear you, Steve.
Yeah.
Looks like it's frozen.
Yeah, it does look like it's frozen. Okay.
Maybe time is up, so it just froze.
Yeah, well, time is up, but okay. Not sure what's going on there. Oh, hey.
And he's gone.
Dan's gone. All right. In other words, no, Steve, you can't ask a question.
Ask it anyway, mate.
Kira, you might be a good one to run this past anyway. I've got a client who, speaking of chemical restraint considerations, I've got a client who I'm aware that they have a specific plan for if they have a behavioural incident and the police or an ambulance needs to be called. And the plan is that the ambulance staff or medical staff, there's specific medications that have been recommended by the psychiatrist to be administered intramuscularly at that particular point. Do we need to account for that as PRN, or is that because it's medically administered? Is that
okay? So
a separate consideration?
Just to let you know, my connection dropped out for about a minute.
I figure, mate.
I know what you mean. So, and this is a key point for everyone. If a medical person, treatment team, ambulance officer administers any medication, that is a restricted practice. Most intramuscular injections will not be administered by support staff.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Even insulin pens for diabetes, most of the time we're teaching the person how to do it, or there's a nurse coming in to do it, or the staff get trained, but it's not a restricted practice unless there's other circumstances around it. But when it comes to sedating the person,
and it is sedating the person. It is in response to a behavioural incident, and the recommendation is if the police are called, they are also to call an ambulance, and if the ambulance is called, they're to give these injections, and that will sedate this person.
Yeah,
it's a planned use of chemical restraint, as far as I'm concerned, but it's also medically administered.
Yeah, so we would be putting it in the plan as a process, as a protocol, but we're not putting a restricted practice through for it, because it's clearly stated in the plan that a medical officer will be administering the medication for the purpose of sedation.
Yeah, yeah.
So the way I look at your plans too, they just need to be really transparent and have as much detail as possible.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And again, I don't know many staff that would do IM injection.
Oh, no, it's not staff. It's clearly in the situation where an ambulance needs to be called.
Yeah, definitely. But I guess these are the questions that you might come across that you've got to problem solve a little bit more and ask the question.
Yeah.
So I'm just aware we are at the end of the time, but does anyone have any other questions related to the PowerPoint, to the RPAs?
That was very good, Dan. Thank you.
Well, I don't take the credit. I worked with Gina on this one and a few other people.
Thank you, and Gina.
Yeah, thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, so if you do have any other questions, I'll just set up just a template and circulate it, and we can all add to it, specifically on RPAs. Okay. Cool. All right. Thanks everyone for coming. I really appreciate you spending the time as well.
Thank you.
Cheers.
See you guys.
Bye.
Thank you.
See you guys. Bye.